The issue of mobility, I think, presents a number of really tough issues for us to solve. And I don't have the answers to these things, but I can tell you what we're thinking about and trying to work on in policy discussions in Boston. We need your input. One is this whole balance between, the social factors and the educational functions in education. How do we balance that out? If we say all these elements that go on in a child's life that prevent that child from attending school or being attentive when they get to school need to be taken into account by educators and need to be resolved by society if we expect students to benefit from radically improved instruction and curriculum, then who does that? Who takes care of that work? Educators are already overtaxed with what we're asking them to do through our new accountability systems, and yet they're realizing 20 years into education reform here in Massachusetts, the top performing state in the country, that schools alone can't do it. We can't do it by ourselves in schools. The job is too big. The amount of time that children spend outside of schools is too big for us to think that on average, schools are going to overcome that. That's not an excuse. That's just an analysis of the facts. 20 years in education reform, we've moved from the middle of the pack to the top of the pack, comparatively speaking, and yet we still have an iron wall correlation between socioeconomic status and educational achievement and attainment. That's a problem. We failed in what we set out to do in education reform in 1993, and we need to not rethink our goal. We got the goal right. We want all students prepared for success. We want all students at proficiency, but we need to rethink the delivery system that we've designed in order to accomplish that. So that's one of the issues. A second issue that this raises is the whole accountability system. We're looking at a federal system of accountability that, after you examine today's results, will show that a substantial majority of Massachusetts schools are underperforming in some sense against AYP, when we're the top performing state in the country. And we have a limited capacity to intervene in underperforming schools. We can handle about 35 schools, which is what we're now doing, chronically underperforming, low-performing, non-improving schools. We need an accountability system that isn't about punishment. It isn't about shame. It isn't about exposure. So it shouldn't necessarily be a crime, a sin, or something negative, however you want to construct it, to be on that list. To be on that list ought to indicate that you've got bigger challenges than other folks have, and therefore you need more support and assistance. And this is just what we're doing under the Achievement Gap Act of 2010, and with some federal assistance in our 35 Level 4 chronically underperforming schools. We're giving them help. We're giving them guidance with planning. We're insisting that that planning ought to include social and human service factors, that it ought to include a connection to early childhood education, and then we're giving them money to build out programs in much the way that, for example, the Peck School here in Holyoke, which is such an example. The governor, again, is coming to that school. He and I will be there on Thursday to look at what they've done in terms of conceptualizing how wraparound services and support look. So we need to have an accountability system with the right set of indicators. How do we know when a school like Peck School is doing a good job at actively mitigating those challenges and problems that children have in their outside lives that get in the way of them coming to school and being attentive when they get there? How do we reward a school for building the connective tissue between educators and educational systems and schools and social and human service agencies in our communities? We need that connective tissues. We're not asking the teachers to do it. As I said before, they're overtaxed. We're asking the teachers to be aware. So if I'm a teacher and I have a child in my class, and that child comes to me and says, I've been living in my car for the past 2 or 3 days, that teacher has a responsibility to have a sufficient relationship to know that, A, and B, to know who in that school she can pick up the phone and call and ask to provide some help to that family to somehow mitigate that problem. Because without that kind of support and assistance, we have no hope of getting that child to proficiency, because she's got too much going on outside of school that's going to get in the way of her learning. So we've got to figure out how to build a better accountability system, and I agree with that recommendation. And then finally, you know, one of the implications that the report raises is whole tension on the one hand between standardization, which even in the throes, in the midst, and in a full embrace of standards-based school reform, we don't want to equate standards with standardization, because we need innovation, we need diversity, we need variety in our system to meet the needs of diverse learners. But one of the logical conclusions when you look at the problem of mobility is if we make everything the same, then it won't matter if people move. But that at the same time works against this objective of having innovation, of having educators close to the ground in every school own the curriculum and instruction, much as a university faculty owns the curriculum and instruction at their particular institution and can do something about it. And so balancing off that tension between allowing sort of local control and diversity and variety and innovation in our individual schools, and yet at the same time standardizing it enough, probably through our standards and broad curriculum expectations, so that as students move, they're not moving into completely foreign territory. That's a balance that from a policy standpoint, it's hard to strike. I mentioned a 21st century school system. Let me tell you just briefly what we feel the outline of such a system should look like, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. One, it's got to be a system with high standards, you know, high quality curriculum, and high quality instruction for each and every child. Sounds like basic common sense. It's a starting point. It's what we've established with our work in 1993. It's what we built on with the Achievement Gap Act and with the help of the federal government and the race to the top, etc. That's important. It's important that that be a pre-K through higher education system that has those qualities from the beginning. Secondly, it's important that it offer the kinds of wraparound services that I talked about earlier in connection with the PEC school. Third, that it be a system that is willing to differentiate between our students. Let's not give everybody the same treatment, the same length of stay. I often use the hospital analogy. I apologize to those of you who've heard me use it before, but we wouldn't open a hospital and have people come through the front door and say to them, irrespective of your ailment, we're going to give you the same treatment and the same length of stay and hope that this contributes to the public health. We just wouldn't do it in medicine. Not that medicine is the pinnacle of efficiency and effectiveness in our society, we know that, but it wouldn't work. It doesn't meet the common sense test, and yet we're doing that in education. We've got kids who start 300 yards behind the finish line in a 100-yard dash, and others who are 25 yards from the finish line when they walk into kindergarten. And yet we say, well, at best, we'll give you the same length of time in school, the same quality of instruction, and yet we're surprised when 13 years later and you cross the finish line and they're not in the same place. We need to build out a system that differentiates and gives people more time when they need more time, and in our culture, we won't view that as a punishment. And that's a stretch. So think of those English language learners that I talked about earlier. Why aren't we setting up English language learning summer camps that give additional time for students who have that challenge every summer? And it's assumed that if you're trying to learn English on top of keeping pace in your academic subjects, you do that. You engage in that kind of activity. Career and college readiness needs to be a dual goal of this new system, as well as a continuous process of innovation. Because much as I say we need a 21st century system of education, we don't actually know exactly what that looks like. We know its characteristics. It needs to meet every child where he or she is and give each child the challenge, the guidance, the support, the curriculum, the instruction, everything that they need to go through the trajectory of learning through early childhood, K-12, and post-secondary education, and emerge ready for success in a broad definition: employment, citizenship, family leadership, and lifelong learning. That's what we're aiming to get to. So, we're trying to work on these issues in a variety of ways. The governor's convened a Child and Youth Readiness Cabinet. We're working on concepts like a readiness passport that will follow each child throughout their career, so we have a portfolio and understand what's going on in that child's life and are able to differentiate and support that child in ways that are tailored to the child's individual need. We're working on trying to get readiness counselors into schools with high concentrations of poverty. They are the embodiment of that connective tissue that I spoke about earlier. Working on problems. We were in Orchard Garden School in Boston a few weeks ago, and they had a cadre of city year volunteers who did nothing but focus on issues of attendance. Work with families on mitigating issues of attendance, because rule number one in schools is common sense rule. If they're not there, they're not going to learn it. So if we don't mitigate the attendance problems and deal with them, not in a punitive way, but in a way that solves the problem that's getting in the way of the child attending, we're not going to get the results and achievement. We're not going to close the achievement gap that we're aiming at doing. We're very concerned about and building, and would love your input on a set of initiatives to respond to the kinds of issues that we see in gateway cities. MassINC has been great at raising and pushing these issues, and we're working with them and others to come up with a gateway cities readiness agenda. We're building through our Race to the Top grants wraparound zones in a number of cities around the Commonwealth, and we hope to install wraparound councils, groups of human and social service providers who focus exclusively on the needs of students in schools in those communities. We've hired for the first time ever a person at a high level in state government who works between Secretary of Health and Human Services Bigby and myself on this Child and Youth Readiness Cabinet to do that work and make it real day to day. We're working on a number of fronts to try and embody the sort of complexity that you're talking about with respect to mobility. And we'll do our utmost on that and continue to work in partnership with you. It's not work that we're going to solve overnight. There isn't a silver bullet here, but I think awareness is a first step, so I'm grateful again to the Rennie Center for putting this on the table and for continuing to push it as we go forward in terms of keeping our feet to the fire and developing solutions to these kinds of problems. The biggest challenge facing this Commonwealth as we look toward the future, there are really four things that this governor is working on hard right now: jobs, closing the achievement gap, reducing health care costs, and reducing youth violence. Two or three of those involve the education system directly. It's our conviction that unless we make progress on solving this achievement gap challenge, at which this mobility issue is at the heart, the future of our Commonwealth is at peril, the future of our democracy is at peril, the future of our society is at peril. So I look forward to working with you on this set of issues, and I thank you for being attentive this morning.